So, Bhante, it is really important for us to hear your voice in these conversations. Before we start, I want to share a little bit about you with people who may not be familiar with what you've contributed to the Dharma. But first, a little fun fact that I came across while I was researching your biography that used to be a musician in quite a successful band before you became a monk. One major contribution that you've made has been in making translations of Pali texts widely available to people through your Sutta Central project.
Yeah.
But maybe more to the point here is another area that you've been very active, which is in working for the reestablishment of full ordination for women or bhikkhuni ordination for women in Buddhism. And in fact, that's where we first met at a conference in Hamburg, where your
Right.
voice was a very important supportive voice in an effort that ultimately did not succeed to reestablish full ordination for women in the Tibetan tradition. But you argued strongly in favor of it then. And then, in fact, in 2013, after participating actively in the reestablishment of full ordination for women in your lineage,
Right.
you turned the monastery that you had founded in Australia over to the Bhikkhuni order.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that not just position, but that active uh, show of support and that creation of an important condition speaks a lot. And I just wanted to acknowledge how moving and how important that is.
Well, thank you so much. It's one of the great joys and honors of my life that I've been able to serve the Dhamma by supporting women to practice the Dhamma. And I think the thing about helping the Bhikkhunis establish a monastery to me is crucial. And we can, those who don't like to see bhikkhunis around, who don't like to see women practicing the Dhamma with full support and so on, spend their time arguing about legalities and so on. And meanwhile, we've just gone ahead and built monasteries and created places for women to stay and to practice. And I supplied, built up Santi Monastery, gave it to the bhikkhunis, and Ajahn Brahm, meanwhile, has also supported establishment of Dhammasara Monastery, Newbury Monastery, and other places. There's like 6 or 7 residences in Australia now for Theravada bhikkhunis to live and practice in. So that's what makes it possible, right? It's not just a legal issue. It's also where are you going to lay your head at the end of a weary day.
Well, this issue of negotiating the sadly wide gap sometimes between what legally is feasible or permissible and what actually happens on the ground is very much the territory that opens up when we start to look at how allegations of abuse are handled in Buddhist communities versus
Right.
how they're laid out in the Vinaya. And I wonder if you could start by just kind of explaining what were the guidelines that the Buddha handed down for his community regarding allegations of abuse against Buddhist monks.
Okay. So this is a very interesting topic because the regulations in the Vinaya regarding this are quite progressive. In fact, more progressive than what most people do these days, I think, in many organizations or most organizations. So there are 2 specific rules that address this in the Vinayas. And I haven't researched this particular point in detail on a comparative basis recently, but I believe that the similar principles apply in all of the Vinayas. Of course, I'm most familiar with the Pali Vinaya. And these rules are called aniyata rules, which is undetermined, is what it means. And the reason it's undetermined is that if a trustworthy laywoman disciple, specify that she's a laywoman disciple, would make an accusation of misconduct against a monk, then that accusation should be investigated. And the monk who if it's found to be correct, then that monk who's been accused should be treated in accordance with that rule. And the uncertainty of it is because the laywoman should not be expected to know which particular rule that the monk has violated, right? That's not her job to study the Vinaya and be able to do that. So when the matter is brought to the Sangha has to then determine which of the rule categories this falls into. If it involves sexual intercourse, then it's a parajika or expulsion rule. If it involves lewd touching or lewd speaking, then it involves a Sanghadisesa suspension rule. Or if it involves something more minor, like say, seeking to be alone in a secluded place or something like that, then that would be under a pacidya, a confessable rule. So Sangha determines that, and then the monk has to abide by the decision which is made from that. And this seems to be the only case in the Vinaya, or at least a very rare case, where the finding of the Sangha on the accusation of the woman prevails, even if the monk themselves denies it. And normally in the Vinaya, the monk has to confess to the offence. But in this one, it seems that that's not required because of the strength of the accusation by the trustworthy laywoman.
And can you talk a little bit about, in general terms, the reliance that's placed on having monks confess their misdeeds?
Well, sure. I mean, the general idea is that so each fortnight we recite the list of rules for the monks. I'm not sure if that tradition, does that tradition still prevail in the Tibetan Sangha? Yeah. So maybe, yeah. So anyway, in the Theravada tradition, we get together every fortnight and we sit down there and recite in Pali 227 rules for monks, or the bhikkhunis recite their own rules. And before that or during that, then we're supposed to confess any offences that we have committed, or any offences that we even feel that we might have committed, or got into any grey areas or something like that. And so almost all the time, then those confessions are simply absolved with, that's it, you just confess it and you say, okay, I'll try to do better next time. The Vinaya is not, as many people think, Vinaya is this really strict, regimented system. Actually, the Vinaya is very open and allows for a lot of flexibility and a lot of interpretation in many areas, right? But of course, then there are some areas where that is not true. And in this, particularly in the area of sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and those kinds of things, then there the Vinaya rules become quite strict. If you have sexual intercourse as a monk, consensual sexual intercourse as a monk or a nun, then you're immediately expelled and you're no longer a member of the Sangha. There's basically no way around that, right? The only exception there is if it's non-consensual. And so if somebody is raped or somebody is assaulted, then that they are not guilty. They have no blame attached to them. The blame is 100% on the person who perpetuates that assault.
So when someone who's deemed, a laywoman who's deemed to be trustworthy, comes forward with an allegation,
yes,
what actually happens next?
well, there's what happens and what should happen, which are unfortunately two different things. What should happen is that the Sangha should meet. They should question, first of all, that the Sangha should discuss that with the laywoman to make sure that her story is clear and that they know exactly what's being said. If she says something that's very vague, like, oh, that monk did something inappropriate, then it's difficult to proceed on that basis. So you need to try to, I know it's not always easy to do that because it can be very awkward or embarrassing or whatever, but you need to first of all try to establish it as clearly as you can, the facts that she's presenting. Then to invite the monk to a meeting of the Sangha, present the accusations to the monk and see what he says. And then the Sangha needs to make a judgment call. Now, I mean, in some cases, you're obviously going to say, well, look, this couldn't happen. I mean, I've had allegations made against myself. And I was in Perth at the time, and this woman rings up from New South Wales, 3,000 kilometres away, and says Sujato's in my yard. He's stalking me, and the monk speaking to him said, "Well, he's actually here." And he's not there. So in that case, well, this is obviously an untrustworthy laywoman. In that case, it was somebody who had mental health issues. And this kind of things happen. And so we try to deal with that. So if on the basis of the facts, then it's shown that it can't be taken seriously, then then that would be dismissed. But given that it's a trustworthy laywoman whose account can be believed, then it's important to take that seriously. And if the monk can't give a good account of themselves, then they should be found that they've committed that offence, and it should be dealt with in accordance with the rules. So if it's a simple matter of confession, then they have to confess it. If it's a suspension, they'd be suspended. And if they have to be expelled from the Sangha, they would be expelled from the Sangha.
Can you explain for the audience what expelled from the Sangha actually entails?
If the Vinaya on that particular matter is very cut and dried and very, very black and white. So essentially, if you've committed sexual intercourse, then at the moment that you do that, you are no longer a monk or no longer a nun. Again, consensual sexual intercourse. That's it. Actually, from the moment of that act, you're not a monk or a nun. And any legal measures are merely really clarifying so that people know what the situation is. But there's no redress, there's no coming back, and you can't ordain as a monk or a nun, bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, again in that life. So that's it. You're finished as far as a full ordination goes. So that's the most clear-cut and non-negotiable fact in the Vinaya that we have.
So I think in general terms, if we look at Vinaya procedure, there is a presumption of innocence.
Very much so, yeah.
And there is an expectation that the testimony that the monk gives when questioned is going to be truthful. But we know that a monk who's been having sex with his students has been lying already for quite some time, right, to cover it up.
Right.
And so procedurally, you have this issue where someone who is already invested in lying and probably has already been lying is then expected to be taken at his word.
Yeah.
So I actually want to bring it a real life case to you, and I've spoken with the nun involved and gotten her permission to discuss this with you here, so we can reflect on the implications together. She had been subjected to sexual abuse by her teacher, who was a fully ordained monk and very senior monk in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And she was able to report her experience after a lot of inner work, was able to report her experience to a very senior monk who was not just an elder in the monastic sangha. He was actually occupied a very in the highest hierarchy of Tibetan Buddhist lineages. And this senior monk believed her.
Okay.
And responded, with distress and concern. And he believed her, and then he painted for her what would come next if she wanted to press the issue. And he told her that she would have to go in a room and sit in front of the perpetrator who had abused her and other senior monks who were his colleagues and often his friends. And she would need to tell all of them what she had told him. And then the teacher, the senior monk who had abused her, would be given an opportunity to tell his version of events, which according to this very senior monk, in all probability, might be different from what she said. And then the senior monks would decide who they would believe. And so after painting this very intimidating picture for her, he told her, this is going to be very shameful for you. In the end, you will be shamed in front of everyone. And I'm quoting here. And everyone will identify you from then on as the person who made this complaint. They will think of you as that person. So you should spare yourself that shame. It's much better to keep quiet and move on. And this person in this very high level did have a position of responsibility, does have a position of responsibility for the monastic sangha. And this was the advice that he gave.
Yeah.
And so, and this was someone who had managed to get to the point where she could tell her story and had an audience and was believed.
Right.
So, there's I wonder if you could comment on this and help understand what happens to transparency and accountability in that
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, thank you for that. I mean, that's obviously like really distressing. And when you put it into that situation, I mean, to give the due to the senior monk who was commenting, I mean, he was being truthful in telling her. I mean, I don't agree with the advice that he gave, like at all, but he honestly represented that distressing situation that she would often find herself in, and that whistleblowers and victims of sexual assault and so on will so often find themselves in similarly distressing situations. I don't agree with his response, because his response to somebody who's in a position of power should have been to recognize that this terrible and unjustified thing has happened. Therefore, we have an obligation to be able to pursue this and figure out a way to pursue this in a way that isn't going to create more distress for the person who has already suffered a lot of distress. And so we shouldn't just accept that this is the way it is and just let it go on like that. So to consider that this is a distressing process and to say, well, how can we ease this distress? And we can, first thing to do would be to ask the person themselves, what could we do that is going to make this process, bearable for you, or whatever. And that's a difficult question for somebody who's come forward. They're not going to have an answer to that off the top of their head, right? When nobody's an expert in these things, nobody's done it before. So they're going to have to maybe consult, consider, have some time to reflect and so on before they're going to think about how they want to proceed. And I think from the Sangha's point of view, that we should be forward in listening to what they want and what they need, and in giving them the support that they might deserve. Some obvious things I think that should have happened. I think that one of the things you mentioned was about, like, you're in the room alone with a bunch of senior monks. It's very intimidating. Obviously, the person should have an advocate or advocates by their side, and they should have people there to support them. There should be bhikkhunis who are there, who are present and able to listen to it and assess it from a Vinaya point of view and give another perspective. And there should be, I mean, these are just some suggestions of what can happen. It's not an easy or an obvious road, and legal systems, leaving aside the Vinaya from 2,500 years ago, but legal systems today all struggle to do this, and it's not a solved problem. So far as I'm aware, it's not a solved problem anywhere.
So we have a situation where the people in positions of authority and power,
Yeah.
certainly in the Vinaya lineage that exists within Tibetan Buddhism, in which until just a few years ago, there were no fully ordained women in that lineage, in
Right.
that Vinaya lineage.
Yeah.
Until, I don't know, it was maybe 3 years ago that in Bhutan there was an ordination held in the Mula Sarvastivada lineage. So none of those none of those fully ordained nuns have been nuns long enough to serve in any kind of ritual Sangha contexts. And they're also not senior enough. But even if they had been ordained for 10 years, you have a situation where there is a complete lack of parity between men and women
Sure.
in these situations. And so I wonder if you can talk about how gender plays into both abuse and also how allegations of abuse are handled.
Okay, thank you. So one of the issues that you're touching on there in terms of like the legal proceedings of the sangha under the Vinaya is that typically the bhikkhus will carry their proceedings out in their community. The bhikkhunis will carry their proceedings out in their community, and of course, there are many women who've ordained and practicing in the Tibetan tradition, but their ordinations from the Chinese lineage. So these are kind of other issues, but just I think one distinction that we can make is that there is a distinction between a formal act of the Vinaya. These formal acts of the Vinaya, Sangha Kammas, are defined in the Vinaya text, and they cover certain procedures such as ordination and, like, if for example, I mentioned before about, say, a suspension, right? So if there's a suspension, then that has to be carried out by a sangha, either bhikkhu or bhikkhuni sangha, in an appropriate way. On the other hand, for example, the parajika, the expulsion offense, that doesn't require any sangha kamma. They're already not a monk. It's simply a matter of realizing that. Now, that process of consultation that we were talking about before is not a formal sangha kamma, right? It's a process of consultation. It's not described in the Vinaya, it's not mandated in a particular way, and it doesn't require any particular people to be present or to not be present. And so as an informal advisory consultative process, then there's no Vinaya reason why different people shouldn't be invited to be present, such as I mentioned before, advocates or bhikkhunis, or maybe facilitators who are expert in this field, or other people who might be able to support that process. So if then the monk is found, let's say the monk is found that they have committed a sangha, so then it would have to be taken to the bhikkhu sangha and then performed in an appropriate ceremony there. So yeah, these are the ways of the ways that the Vinaya works. But one of the things that I have always found is that the way that the Vinaya is formed in most cases has a light touch that allows us to adapt and to practice it in ways that are going to be supporting the flourishing of all the people who need to do it. I'll just give you one example of that. The monastery I used to be at in Santi Forest Monastery, we had both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis staying there. Now, in the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, one of the rules, it says that the bhikkhunis should invite, at the end of the rains retreat, they should invite admonition from the bhikkhu sangha. Okay, so this is a rule. There's no corresponding rule for bhikkhus. Fine. That's just what the text says, right? We can't do anything about that. It's 2,500 years old. We just received that text. On the other hand, there's no rule saying the bhikkhus should not invite the bhikkhunis for admonishment. It's just not required. It's not forbidden. It's not required. So when we did it, we would just ask the bhikkhunis for admonishment. And so
But in
that's
the eight heavy dhammas,
uh-huh.
bhikkhunis are not permitted to point out the ethical failings of bhikkhus, right?
There is a rule to that effect, although again, that's there's a whole conversation around that. But that does not stop us from inviting criticism.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
talking about workarounds to
we're talking about
circumvent the institutional inequality that's
yeah,
baked into some aspects of the institution.
yeah, and if you do it in that way, right? One of the things that you can do is you can highlight the fact that, well, actually these rules are some of these rules are kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, why is that not so? I mean, there's a whole background to that. Personally, I don't believe that that rule was ever really observed. And I think that there are actually a number of historical examples of bhikkhunis admonishing bhikkhus found in, for example, things like, say, the Ashoka and Mulasarasjivada Vinaya and some things like this, where bhikkhunis find very nice ways to give admonitions to monks, and it seems to be just fine, actually. So, from my point of view, this is just a normal part of being human. I don't really have a problem with it. Yeah, it's it's tricky because the original Pali is quite, I don't want to get into the technicalities, but the original Pali is quite idiomatic. And so what the exact implications of the phrase are is not as clear as one might like it to be. Yeah.
That's always good. Having space to maneuver is always helpful in these situations. But I think, if we look at the structures that these issues are playing out within, I think it's clear that we're seeing that there are structures, such as in that situation that was painted for that nun who had been abused, where everyone with power is a monk, as in is holding power within an institution that is designed to protect their positions of power, and therefore the place that women or survivors of abuse or whistleblowers are given is to the margins or outside. So we're talking about institutional agendas that make it very difficult for all of the beautiful principles that the Buddha was encouraging people to live, to actually implement.
Yeah, yeah. Look, absolutely. And I think that the real problem is that these patriarchal institutions exist. Personally, I don't think they should exist. And I know that that's going to be controversial within Tibetan Buddhism or whatever, but I'm just calling it like I see it. If a woman was to come to me and ask, should I participate in this kind of top-down absolutist hierarchy, my answer would be absolutely not. Stay away, because you have no safety as long as those institutions exist. And until those institutions can demonstrate that they no longer operate in that way, my advice to women would be stay away. You're not safe.
Well, with all due respect, if women had to stay away from every space in which they were not safe, they would never leave their homes.
Yeah, yeah. That is true. I don't know. I don't know what to say. All I can say is that if that's a question, if somebody, it's not a question that it's not something I'm going to be telling somebody. I'm not going to be going around lecturing to people about this. But if somebody asks me about that, that would be my advice. Yeah,
Well,
I do think that I do think that there are spiritual spaces that are relatively safe for women, and I think that there are a lot of people who've made efforts to try to make that possible.
so let's talk about the efforts that can be made, because certainly from
Right.
where I sit, and I also know from where you sit, the idea is not to cede the patriarchal space to those who wish to wield power within it, but to really work to make safe spaces, recognizing that work needs to be made, that
Yeah.
the many of the institutions are not able to uphold their own principles of creating safe spaces precisely because of the power dynamics. So what has been done that you've seen, and what can be done to make safe spaces for everyone within institutions or around institutions that are profoundly patriarchal?
Look, if I was going to answer honestly, I would say nothing, to be honest. I think if the institution has been established in that way, the chances of actually reforming and improving it are approaching nil. And the reality is that any institution has an endless capacity to create the appearance of change. And you won't know, like they can say, yes, these are our policies. and they can say all the right things, and they can assure you that this will happen and that this will happen and this will happen. But at the end of the day, so long as the power is held in an unaccountable way, then you have no guarantee. And it's just up to the goodwill of that person. And if somebody has power, then all of the desires and concerns and fears and struggles of the people without power, right, can be listened to so long as it's convenient for the one who has power. And the moment that it's not convenient, then they can just dismiss that and walk off the stage, and it means nothing to them. Now, hopefully that wouldn't happen. All I'm saying is that from an institutional basis, you have no guarantee that that's not going to happen. And we've seen plenty of examples everywhere where exactly that kind of thing happens. So again, from my point of view, if your perspective is that, look, I understand that people's spiritual path is not rational. People are drawn to something. People go into a space and they feel a connection. They see a teacher and they feel inspired. And we can't like rationalize these things, right? So that's okay. People follow their path. But if your idea is that I'm going to step within this space and I'm going to change it in this way and that way, my experience has been that that is a long, slow process that is almost certainly doomed to failure. Just give one simple example. I was at a meeting here in Sydney, interfaith meeting to consult with the government on various things. This was just before COVID. And the government, to give the government its due, a conservative government was trying to consult with religious bodies to hear people's points of view. Fine. Invite a bunch of religious leaders to Parliament. We're all sitting there talking. Literally the only woman in the room from a religious background was the nuns from Fo Guangshan, who are the local nuns. So they were there. Everybody else, all the other religious people from every other background. Oh, I think there was one. The Zoroastrian they had a lady there as well. But all the Christians, all the Muslims, all the Jews, everybody, it was all men. And so, I said, why don't we try to invite some women to come along to these meetings? And the response from the then Minister for Multicultural Affairs was, well, even my own party hasn't been very successful in that regard, so I don't think we're going to see much progress there. That was his response. This is how difficult it is to try to reform things within institutions. Now, if somebody wants to do that, good on them. I'm not saying people shouldn't, and I'm not trying to disincentivize people from doing that. You want to do that? Great. I'll help you in whatever way that I can, All I'm saying is that my experience has shown that to me, what I found is the more effective way is to just go around the side, do your own thing, build your own community, and create something that has worth and has value. And rather than trying to battle with the endless weight of bricks and mortar and time and stone, which just takes a tidal wave to do anything to shift them.
So you're saying create alternative spaces.
Create alternative spaces, exactly. Do something new, do something creative. Take the opportunity to say, look, we have all of this tradition, that's great. Nobody's dismissing the tradition. I mean, traditions transmit the Dharma to us, and they transmit to us so many things that's so wonderful. But we also have a capacity to create something new. Every single one of those traditions was founded by somebody who had the courage and the commitment and the energy and the time and the skill to make something new. That's where they all came from. So why don't we try to do something? I can guarantee you that if you were to go back in time and look at the people who founded all of those lineages and all of those schools, none of them really thought that's what they were doing, and probably none of them would have thought that they were capable of doing it. They just did what they did, and people built upon it. And there are so many examples of people who've done innovative things, who've just tried out new ways of doing things, created new communities, created new lineages, sometimes, and sometimes that might be in a very traditional space. I work as a Sangha member within within a Vinaya context and so on. So we still have a fairly traditional approach to many things. Other people just, okay, we'll throw that away and we'll start a new community and, don't worry about all of that lineage stuff. And I think that creativity and imagination is really essential for the vitality of any religious path. And so try things out, and we know that often it might not work. That's okay. But as long as we give our heart to it, then we'll still do something worthwhile.
So what do Buddhist spaces that are anti-patriarchal and still respect and appreciate what they've received from their lineages, what does that look like?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess we are trying to find out, right? Uh, I mean, I can just share a few things from, I guess, from my background and my experience. Now, as a monk, and as a monk with, approaching somewhat seniority these days, um, people tend to put me in that seat, right? So people will tend to, when they come and say, "Oh, great teachers come," and so on and so forth, and they invite me, and they kind of put you in the fancy seat and these kinds of things. So, I respect that that's part of the tradition, but also I'm Australian, I mean, I'm not really into bowing and scraping and fancy seats and all of these kinds of things. So, I always sort of try to steer my way to a kind of more sort of gently equitable kind of environment, and trying to encourage people to speak, trying to listen to people's concerns, particularly trying to give support for women who are in the environment, and just to try to give some words of encouragement or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean that's what I can do. But it's also like for me, and I mean another thing about that is that what I can do in this sphere is limited simply because I'm a bloke and because I'm a monk. So what I found when I was running Santi Forest Monastery for 10 years, I was forming a Bhikkhuni community and trying to encourage the Bhikkhuni community there. But of course, I was much senior to, I founded the monastery and I was much senior to anybody else who was there. So whenever there would be problems, people would come to me. Fair enough, but on the other hand, I can't be like a monk solving the nuns' problems. I'm happy to help people, but the community has to figure out how to solve their own problems. And so, that which is one of the reasons why I left the monastery and I invited the Bhikkhuni Sangha and continue to support the Bhikkhuni Sangha to flourish there. Because they need to figure out their own way to do this. Which, of course, when you give people the opportunity, then they'll rise to the occasion. Yeah.
So the last time you and I spoke, we were exploring this way in which the patriarchy requires a tremendous amount of effort to be maintained and defended. And this obvious conclusion that it's not natural or inevitable,
Right.
but that we are reproducing it generation after generation because we are conditioned in ways that favor the reproduction of patriarchal relationships.
Right.
So if we're thinking of, which we are, if we're thinking about creating, sets of relationships that are not patriarchal, we need to address the ways that we are silent carriers of patriarchal assumptions, or inherent biases with us. So can you talk about how you address that part, the inner
How we
patriarchy?
you mean the inner patriarchy? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, visibilizing it,
Visibilizing, what does that mean?
making visible the way that the biases where when a woman is in a position of leadership, it kind of like irks you and you kind of question and you wonder and you feel like you're being, you know, like something isn't quite right. Whereas if it's a man, it's much easier to just, oh yeah, it seems much more natural to us.
Right.
There's one Dharma center that I'm familiar with where they always insist that they have a completely horizontal structure. They have a very strong kind of,
Okay.
and they're all women and one man.
Hmm.
And I knew because I would, be invited to teach there and we would work out the program and everything. I would work it out in a conversation with that one man. It was very clear that he was the director, the leader, making decisions, wielding authority. And the narrative was, no, 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 we're all here, we're all equal. So it seems so natural that, of course, well,
Right.
that it didn't even rise to
Right.
awareness.
Right.
So that and the many different ways that it's just, women are conditioned to see themselves as in a supportive role.
Right. Right.
Certainly in Mahayana Buddhism, where the bodhisattva and bodhicitta, you should serve others and you should,
Right.
be attentive to other people's needs, where most women are already socialized to do that in the first place.
Right. Right.
That can be very disempowering in a spiritual path and certainly can make those sorts of patriarchal structures reproduce themselves almost as if on their own. So
Yeah.
talking about it, really making it an object of conversation
Right.
and, so making it visible, problematizing it, questioning it, and then working to transform it are kind of
Right.
the
Right.
three steps that the trajectory that I see us as needing to take.
Yeah, look, that all sounds great. Yeah, and I can concur that these things are very much the case. Um, it's funny how our perceptions around these things also, of course, are determined by our upbringing and family background and the kind of in my family, my mum. My mum's quite a strong woman and so on, and my sister, older sister, like these kinds of issues they were never sort of part of our family or part of our family dynamic really, so I never, you know, never even thought of treating my sister as anything different, and I was never sort of modeled any of those kind of toxic male behaviors. A few years, I didn't even realize this. You don't notice these things when you're growing up, right? You're just like, it's just how things are. And then you get older and you look around, why are they doing that? You know? And a few years ago, I spoke to my dad about it. And I said, Dad, I just want to say thank you for not bringing me up with all of this toxic masculinity rubbish. And like, I never saw you like objectifying women or talking down to women or anything like that. And I was just never saw that behavior. And he just said that, I mean, he grew up also, he was raised by his mother, who's a strong mother. And he said, like, he just always hated all that stuff. If he was like, when he was a young man, he was at uni or something and he was with some guys and they'd like catcall a woman or something like that. And he just always couldn't stand it. And it wasn't something that he really sort of thought about or anything. It was just, that just wasn't who he was. So there's that aspect where I think it's really important to just to understand like where you're coming from personally and where other people are coming from personally. Um, because that is going to impact the way that the institutional structures work. Now, the other side of it is also true, right? If we're talking about internalizing attitudes, misogyny is also real, and misogyny as a psychological drive to hurt women is a massive defilement and a massive force of cruelty within men and also, of course, within some women as well. And that is supported and enabled by unequal institutions. And yeah, in a sense, men who nurse misogynistic tendencies are drawn towards environments where they can be justified in those tendencies, where they have an ancient scripture that they can quote in reference to it, and where they are respected and worshipped and revered for that, and where they will not have to ever suffer the consequences of their own misogyny or investigate it or inquire as to it. So this is something which is very real and which plays itself out a lot in religious circles. Now, I'm not sure, don't have that enough familiarity with the Tibetan tradition to be able to say, but certainly within the Theravada tradition, when you know people personally, you know that the supposedly impersonal or objective legal arguments are not all that's to it, and that actually there's a reason why some people find certain kinds of arguments persuasive. And it's not just that they've been objectively convinced by the facts or whatever, but it comes from inside themselves. And that desire to be cruel, that desire to hurt, is something which is, if the institutions aren't able to overcome that, then that will be activated, supported, and enabled, and will come out. And that can also spread. Like, that's infectious, because actually all of us have greed, hatred, and delusion inside us. So for the perspective of a leader should be to connect with the best in the people around them and to draw out the best in people around them. But if the leader is acting from that position of misogyny, which very often they are, then they will connect with that in their students, and they will draw them out and manifest that through the organization. And to be honest, there's really nothing, I don't think there's anything you can really do about that. You know, once you get into that situation, it's really hard for people to change. You know, you have to leave the organization, you have to get out. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly battling against that tide.
You're taking us into this really fertile territory, and I know you've done a lot of what we could call social justice work or engaged Buddhist work, which is where, you know, we have this focus that the Dharma does so well of identifying, you know, greed, attachment, and ignorance or delusion within us.
Right.
But the social justice optic looks at it writ large and sees how that forms our institutions. And so this is, I just would love to hear your reflections on what Buddhism can contribute to understanding structural violence. You know, the ways in which the delusions that are inside us, you know, structure our society and our relationships and cause harm.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, if we're going to talk more on that general topic as you just phrased it there, then one starting point would be something like, say, the Aganya Sutta, which you have in the Pali Canon, and there's a version of that also in the Tibetan Vinaya as well. So, and this tells the story of the creation of the world, and the creation of the world. You know, originally there is abundance and so on, and then greed comes into play. That's number one. Then I'm going to have this, I'm going to own this, and you're not going to have that. Possessiveness comes into play. And then you have, well, stealing, right? And then you have, okay, we're going to have a justice system. So then we have punishment, and then people will lie to the justice system. So all of these kinds of things then spiral. And so that's giving a very kind of explicit narrative in a you know, obviously it's a parable, right? But it's giving a narrative example of how those inner defilements manifest, as you're saying, in social institutions, which in some way are an expression of those, but also which have to try to manage and to moderate them. When we want to make if we want to make an environment where men and women are going to be equal, and where there is going to be safety for women, we are not the first generation to do that. All generations in the past have dealt with these issues in their own ways. And there are things that we can learn from how people in the past have done that. We're not trapped by, the problem with institutional patriarchy is that it's trapped by the solutions that were made in the past, and it has no further answer than to continue repeating those solutions. Right? But we want to create a new solution, but creating that new solution does not mean that everything that everyone did in the past was wrong, and it doesn't mean that we don't have anything to learn from it. Right? We can learn from it, interrogate it, reflect on it, and then come to our new and hopefully better way of doing things.
So I don't want to conclude without asking you to explore a comment that I appreciate very much, which is that the original Buddhist community that the Buddha set up, the monastic community or Sangha, could best be described as an anarchist collective.
What do you think?
Oh, I want to hear I want people to hear what you think first.
What do you think? What do you think of when if you hear the word an anarchist collective? Like what springs to your mind?
Sign me up.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Look, when I was 18, 19, I got involved with this anarchist group in Perth. Most anarchist groups, we just sat around and talked about things. But we did a few kind of actions. We did some like leafleting, anti-Murdoch leafleting, warning people that Rupert Murdoch was an imminent danger to society, which, yeah, was absolutely right. And we did like anti-environmental exploitation by McDonald's. We said McDonald's is a threat to the environment and so on, which again, yeah, I think we were right on that one as well. So we did just a few things like that. And honestly, I don't really know much about anarchism, but the few things that I did learn from it at the time was that anarchist philosophy was based on consensus decision making, right, rather than majority decision, that it was based on direct representation so that the people concerned would actually be in the room rather than electing a representative to act on your behalf. That generally property, at least major property, would be held in common, and sort of de-emphasizing or eliminating personal property. There's probably some other things as well, and a commitment. Most anarchists also have a commitment to pacifism as well, so that's a kind of a part of most anarchist philosophy. Of course, when people think about anarchists, they usually think of bomb-throwing nut jobs who are out to tear society down. But anarchism basically just means that people can work together to find out their solutions for things. I gave a talk about that a number of years ago, and honestly, the reason that I gave that talk was because the then president of the great United States of America was whining about how New York was an anarchist state, and I mean it's just such nonsense, right? But so
if only.
Just kind of felt like kind of talking about this. And so you do see a number of those principles in the Vinaya, right? So the Vinaya decision making is by consensus. So almost all the time when Vinaya procedures, such as the ones we've discussed earlier in the talk, they have to be done, everybody within the Sema, that is everyone within the monastic boundary, has to be present. And
which is a way of saying everyone within the community, within that particular community, just in layman's terms, like people's terms.
Exactly, everyone in the community, exactly. So the monastic boundary defines who is in that community. And then you do it in the presence of, and the presence of has to be in the presence of the person who's involved. It has to be in the presence of the Sangha, the community, and it has to be in presence of the Dhamma and the Vinaya, which means you have essentially a legal and moral guidelines for doing it. So this very much an anarchist principle. Also, there's no representative democracy. So you don't like elect somebody to speak on your behalf, except in there are some specific limited cases where you can do those things. So there are mechanisms within the Vinaya to allow you to do that if you choose. But the normal way of doing it is that everybody participates. Again, property is, the Sangha, we have, simple personal property, but we don't own like buildings and land and things like that, which is owned by the Sangha. So, so these to me are some aspects of the Vinaya that are in common with basic anarchist principles. So I'm actually having a chat tomorrow with somebody who's doing a book on Buddhism and anarchism. So we're going to be hopefully I'll be able to learn more about anarchism then. Yeah.
So let me just ask you to kind of wrap up. If you could speak directly to people who are concerned about the position of women within Buddhism, and specifically with the way that survivors of abuse have been doubly harmed and abusers have been allowed to continue in their roles. What would you say to people who are distressed or concerned or shaken by that fact?
Yeah.
And specifically, what can they do about it?
Well, first I would say that you've done nothing wrong, that you are the wronged party, and that if these things have happened to you, that these things should never have happened, and the suffering that you're undergoing is not caused by you, it's caused by others, and there is no need for that. The Buddha never wanted any of us to suffer. The Buddha did everything that he could to try to help us to be free of suffering. And if we approach a Buddhist context and that results in us suffering, and us suffering those really severe traumas and anxieties, then that's not what the Buddha wanted. So you'd be really clear about this. It doesn't matter who the lineage is, who the teacher is, how respected they are, what people say. If these things are happening, this is not Buddhism. It's not what, well, it might be Buddhism, but it's not what the Buddha wanted. And so protect yourself, look after yourself, find somebody to talk to about it, and do what you need to do to be in a safe space for yourself and to encourage that for others. Don't think that somehow they'll get better. They won't. Don't think that somehow you can change somebody. It's not your responsibility. Don't think that somehow if you're just sort of patient and accept it and humble enough, then somehow you can let go and the problem will go away. That's not the problem. That's their projection on you to make you believe that you're the problem. So just stand by what you know to be true, and inside you, you know what's right and what's wrong. And if something's happened to you that is harmful and is causing you distress, then do what you need to do to get out of that situation, to find safety for yourself, and to find the help and support that you need. And never forget that it can feel very lonely and shameful to be in that situation, but you are not alone. And there are others who've been through that situation, and there are others who will have sympathy and will not be judging you and not be condemning for you, but will only feel in compassion for you.
And what can you say to other people in the community who are not directly abused or assaulted, but who have had their faith shaken or have had to choose sides and have been part of a community where this has taken place?
It's really hard to leave a community or to decide that, or to realize that you've made a mistake. Communities answer to something inside of us and they bring us up to something. But sometimes you have to do that. If you feel that institutional abuse is happening within that community, especially if it comes from the senior teachers, or if the issue's been raised and it hasn't been dealt with swiftly and appropriately, then my advice would be to leave that community. Don't mistake the gifts, the gifts or the benefits that you've received through a community come from inside you. I mean, the community might have enabled that or called them out or given you something to respond to. But whatever you've found, if there is something genuine that you found through that community, some genuine wisdom, some genuine peace, some genuine sense of value, then that is inside you, and it's not going to stop just because you leave that community. There are plenty of communities around the world that are not like that. And if you take the care and the time and the trouble, you will find people who will be willing to support you and who will not be taking advantage of you.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing your words myself, and I receive them with a lot of appreciation.
Damcho, I'm so honored to be able to be part of this conversation.